The day Josephine Miller turned 18, her mother locked her out of the house for 3 days straight because the Hendersons were visiting from Topeka and there simply was not enough room for a full grown daughter when important guests needed comfortable beds. She spent those nights curled up in the barn, listening to the horses breathe and watching moonlight filter through gaps in the wooden slats, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. The year was 1876, and Ellsworth, Kansas had grown from a rough cattle town into something approaching civilization, though Josephine's circumstances suggested otherwise. Her mother, Margaret Miller, had always been a woman who valued appearances above all else. After Josephine's father died in a ranch accident when she was only 12, Margaret had transformed their modest home into a boarding house of sorts, constantly entertaining visitors, potential suitors, and anyone who might elevate her social standing. Josephine had learned early that her presence was often considered an inconvenience, something to be hidden away when it suited her mother's purposes. The morning after the Hendersons finally departed, Josephine dragged herself back into the house, hay stuck in her dark hair, her clothes rumpled and dusty. Margaret barely glanced at her as she prepared breakfast, humming a cheerful tune as though nothing unusual had occurred. "There is oatmeal in the pot," Margaret said, her voice light and unconcerned. "Make yourself presentable afterward. The Reverend and his wife are coming for supper tonight." Josephine's hands trembled as she ladled oatmeal into a bowl. "Mother, I cannot keep sleeping in the barn. It is not safe, and it is not right." Margaret turned, her expression hardening. "You will do as you are told under my roof. You are fortunate I provide for you at all. Many girls your age are already married and gone. Until you find yourself a husband, you will contribute to this household in whatever way I see fit." "I contribute plenty," Josephine said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I cook, I clean, I tend the garden, I help with the laundry. I do everything you ask." "And you will continue to do so," Margaret replied dismissively. "Now eat quickly. Those linens will not wash themselves." Josephine choked down the tasteless oatmeal, each spoonful sitting heavy in her stomach. She had lived this way for 6 years now, ever since her father's death had shifted the entire dynamic of their household. Before the accident, she had been cherished, loved, treated like the daughter she was. After, she had become little more than unpaid help, shuffled aside whenever it proved convenient. The days blurred together in endless work. Josephine scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached, and smiled politely at her mother's endless parade of guests, while knowing she would be banished to the barn the moment they required a bed. She watched other girls her age walking through town with their families, courted by young men, attending church socials and dances. Her own life felt impossibly small, contained within the walls of her mother's house and the dark corners of the barn where she was sent to sleep. It was on a sweltering July afternoon, 3 months after her 18th birthday, that everything changed. Josephine had been sent into town to purchase supplies, her mother's shopping list clutched in one hand and a small purse of coins in the other. The streets of Ellsworth bustled with activity, cowboys fresh from cattle drives spending their wages, merchants hawking their wares, and respectable townspeople going about their business. She had just emerged from the general store, her arms laden with packages, when a group of rowdy cowboys burst out of the saloon across the street. Their horses, startled by the commotion, reared and bolted. One massive bay gelding charged directly toward Josephine, its eyes rolling white with fear. She froze, unable to move, packages tumbling from her arms. The horse bore down on her, and she could see nothing but its enormous chest and flailing hooves. Then, in a blur of motion, someone grabbed her around the waist and hauled her backward with such force that they both tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The horse thundered past where she had been standing just seconds before, missing them by inches. Josephine lay in the dirt, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Slowly she became aware of the strong arms still wrapped around her, of a solid chest rising and falling rapidly beneath her cheek. "Are you hurt, miss?" The voice was deep and gentle, tinged with concern. Josephine pushed herself up slightly and found herself looking into the most extraordinary pair of eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of amber in sunlight, warm and bright, set in a face that was all sharp angles and sun-bronzed skin. Dark hair curled slightly beneath a dusty hat, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed a strong jaw. I I do not think so, she managed, suddenly aware that they were lying in the middle of the street, drawing curious stares from passers-by. The man helped her to her feet with easy strength, his hands gentle but steady. He was tall, she realized, perhaps 6 feet, with the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his days working hard. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn denim and leather, a gun belt slung low on his hips, but there was something different about him, something in the careful way he looked at her that made her breath catch. "That was close," he said, retrieving his hat from where it had fallen. "Those fellows ought to be more careful. You could have been killed." "You saved my life," Josephine said, the reality of it sinking in. If he had not acted so quickly, she would have been trampled. "Thank you does not seem adequate, but thank you." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her stomach flutter. "I am just glad I was in the right place at the right time. The name is Russell Foster. My friends call me Russ." "Josephine Miller," she replied, offering her hand without thinking. He took it, his palm warm and calloused against hers, and shook it gently. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and from the way his eyes widened slightly, she thought he might have felt it too. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Miller, though I wish it had been under less dramatic circumstances." He glanced around at her scattered packages. "Let me help you gather your things." Together they collected the items that had spilled from her arms, Josephine trying desperately to calm her racing heart. She was acutely aware of him beside her, of the easy grace with which he moved, of the faint scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. When everything had been retrieved, he carried the packages for her, insisting despite her protests. "Where are you headed?" he asked as they walked down the wooden sidewalk. "Home," she said, then hesitated. "Actually, I should probably return these to my mother's house. It is just on the edge of town, near the creek." "I know the area," Russell said. "I just signed on at the Fletcher Ranch, about 5 miles west of here. Been working my way up from Texas, looking for a place to settle. Ellsworth seems like good country." They walked together through the warm afternoon, and Josephine found herself talking more freely than she had in years. There was something about Russell Foster that made her feel safe, seen in a way she had not experienced since her father died. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. When they reached the small house where she lived with her mother, Josephine felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. She did not want this encounter to end, did not want to return to her narrow existence of endless chores and barn floors. Russell set the packages on the porch, then turned to face her. "Miss Miller, I know we have only just met, but I would very much like to see you again. Would you permit me to call on you sometime?" Josephine's heart soared, then just as quickly plummeted. My mother is very particular about visitors. I do not think she would approve." Something flickered in his amber eyes, something that looked like understanding mixed with determination. "Then perhaps I could see you in town? Maybe at church this Sunday?" "Yes," Josephine said quickly, before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I would like that very much." His smile was radiant. "Then I will see you Sunday, Miss Miller." She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly down the dusty road, and allowed herself a moment of pure, unbridled hope. Perhaps her life was not as narrow as she had believed. Perhaps there were still possibilities waiting for her, chances for something more than sleeping in barns and living at her mother's whims. That hope sustained her through the rest of the week, even when Margaret announced that the Carlsons would be visiting from Abilene and Josephine would need to make herself scarce. She endured 2 more nights in the barn without complaint, her mind filled with the memory of amber eyes and a warm smile, of strong arms catching her and a gentle voice asking if she was hurt. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Josephine, dressed in her best gown, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her dark hair as prettily as she could manage. Margaret looked at her with suspicion but said nothing, too preoccupied with her own preparations to question her daughter's unusual attention to appearance. The church in Ellsworth was a modest white building with a tall steeple, packed every Sunday with townspeople and ranchers from the surrounding area. Josephine and her mother arrived early, taking their usual place near the back. As the pews filled, Josephine's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a tall figure with dark hair and a particular way of moving. She spotted him just as the service was about to begin, slipping into a seat across the aisle and several rows ahead. As if feeling her gaze, Russell turned and looked directly at her, his face breaking into that smile that made her pulse quicken. He nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle that no one else would have noticed, and Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest. The service passed in a blur. Josephine could not have repeated a single word of the sermon if her life had depended on it. All her attention was focused on the man across the aisle, on the breadth of his shoulders beneath his clean shirt, on the way he held his hat respectfully in his lap, on the way he occasionally glanced back at her with those remarkable eyes. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to disperse, Josephine tried to make her way toward Russell, but her mother's hand clamped down on her arm. "We need to get home," Margaret said firmly. "I have dinner preparations to oversee." "But mother, I wanted to—" "Now, Josephine." Josephine's heart sank, but as they moved toward the door, Russell appeared at her side as if by magic. He removed his hat and addressed Margaret with perfect politeness. "Mrs. Miller, I presume—" "I am Russell Foster. I had the good fortune of making your daughter's acquaintance earlier this week, and I wanted to introduce myself properly." Margaret looked him up and down, her expression calculating. "Mr. Foster, I do not believe I know your family." "No, madam, you would not. I am recently arrived from Texas, working at the Fletcher Ranch. I am a cattleman by trade, though I hope to own my own spread someday." "I see," Margaret said, her tone cooling several degrees. A cowboy with no family connections and no land was clearly not what she had envisioned for her daughter. "That is very ambitious of you. Come along, Josephine." But Russell was not so easily dismissed. "Mrs. Miller, I wonder if you might permit me to call on your daughter? With your approval, of course. I would very much like to get to know Miss Miller better." Margaret's smile was tight and false. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Foster, but Josephine has many responsibilities at home. I am afraid she has little time for social calls." Josephine felt her brief spark of hope guttering out, but Russell simply nodded, undeterred. "I understand completely, madam. Perhaps then I might see Miss Miller at the church social next month. I understand it is a community event." There was no polite way for Margaret to refuse without drawing attention, and she clearly knew it. "Perhaps," she said stiffly. "Now, if you will excuse us." She practically dragged Josephine away, her fingers digging painfully into her daughter's arm. They walked home in tense silence, and the moment they were through the door, Margaret rounded on her. "You will stay away from that man," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "He is nothing but a drifter, a cowboy with no prospects and no family. You will not embarrass me by associating with his kind." "He saved my life," Josephine protested. "He is kind and respectful, and he asked your permission properly. What more could you want? I want better for you than a hard life on some dusty ranch, breaking your back and aging before your time. You will marry someone of standing, someone who can provide properly." "Like who?" Josephine demanded, her frustration finally boiling over. "No one of standing has ever shown the slightest interest in me, mother. You make sure of that, keeping me hidden away, sending me to sleep in the barn whenever someone important visits. I am 18 years old, and I have no life, no friends, no future beyond serving you." Margaret's hand flashed out, catching Josephine across the cheek with a sharp slap. You ungrateful girl, after everything I have done for you, this is how you speak to me? You will go to your room and think about your behavior. And since you seem so fond of complaining about the barn, perhaps a few more nights there will remind you to be thankful for what you have. Josephine pressed her hand to her stinging cheek, tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give her mother that satisfaction. Instead, she turned and walked upstairs with as much dignity as she could muster, closing her bedroom door quietly behind her. She sank onto the narrow bed, her entire body shaking with anger and hurt and a desperate longing for something different. In her mind, she kept seeing Russell's face, kept hearing his gentle voice asking if she was hurt. Someone had cared about her well-being. Someone had wanted to see her again, and her mother had dismissed him without a second thought. The next few weeks were miserable. True to her threat, Margaret found excuses to send Josephine to the barn nearly every other night, whether they had guests or not. The summer heat made the barn stifling, and Josephine often woke covered in sweat, hay sticking to her skin, her back aching from sleeping on the hard floor. She worked from dawn until long after dark, her hands raw from scrubbing, her shoulders in constant pain from hauling water and carrying heavy loads. But through it all, she held on to the memory of Russell Foster and his warm amber eyes. She thought about him while she scrubbed floors, imagined conversations with him while she hung laundry to dry, and dreamed of him during those long nights in the barn. He became her lifeline, a bright spot in an otherwise bleak existence. She did not expect to see him again so soon. The church social was still weeks away, and her mother had made it clear that Josephine was not to seek him out. But Russell Foster proved to be far more resourceful than Margaret Miller had anticipated. It was a Thursday afternoon, brutally hot with the sun beating down mercilessly on the Kansas prairie. Josephine was in the garden behind the house, trying to coax vegetables from the dry earth, when she heard a horse approach. She looked up, shading her eyes against the glare, and felt her heart leap into her throat. Russell sat astride a beautiful chestnut mare, looking every inch the confident cowboy. But his expression was troubled as he dismounted and approached the garden fence. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Forgive me for coming unannounced, but I needed to see you. I have been hearing things in town, and I need to know if they are true." Josephine set down her hoe, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. "What things?" "That your mother mistreats you. That she makes you sleep in the barn when she has guests. That she works you like a servant rather than treating you like her daughter." His eyes searched her face, and she knew he could see the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her dress hung looser than it should on her frame, the barely healed bruise on her cheek where Margaret had slapped her. You should not concern yourself with such matters," Josephine said, but her voice lacked conviction. Russell's jaw tightened. "Miss Miller, Josephine, I cannot stop thinking about you. Since the moment I pulled you out of that horse's path, I have not been able to get you out of my mind, and if what I am hearing is true, then I cannot stand by and do nothing." "There is nothing you can do," Josephine said softly. "She is my mother. This is my home. I have nowhere else to go. You could come with me." The words hung in the air between them, shocking and impossible, and exactly what Josephine's desperate heart wanted to hear. She stared at him, unable to form a response. Russell stepped closer to the fence, his eyes intense. "I know it is sudden. I know we barely know each other. But I have never felt this way about anyone before, and I do not believe in wasting time when something matters. Come with me, Josephine. Let me take you away from this place. Let me give you a life where you are cherished instead of hidden away." "I cannot," Josephine whispered, even as every fiber of her being screamed that she should. "It would not be proper. People would talk. I would ruin your reputation." "I do not give a damn about my reputation," Russell said fiercely. "And we will make it proper. Marry me, Josephine. Right now, today. The Reverend would perform the ceremony. You would be my wife, and no one could say a word against it." Josephine's head spun. Marriage. To this man she had met only once, spoken to for perhaps an hour in total. It was madness. It was reckless. It was everything she had been taught to guard against. It was also the answer to every prayer she had whispered into the darkness of the barn, every desperate wish for escape, every longing for someone to see her and value her and want her for herself. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I will marry you. The joy that blazed across Russell's face was almost painful in its intensity. Truly? You mean it? I mean it, Josephine said, and felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. But we must go now, before my mother returns. She went into town and will be back within the hour. Russell vaulted over the fence with athletic grace, landing beside her in the garden. Then let us not waste another moment. Is there anything you need to take? Josephine thought of her small room upstairs, of her few possessions, of the life she was about to leave behind. Just a few things. Give me 5 minutes. She ran into the house, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. In her room, she grabbed her father's pocket watch, the one precious item she owned that connected her to him. She stuffed a change of clothes into a small bag, along with the little bit of money she had managed to save over the years. It was not much, perhaps $3 in coins, but it was hers. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror on the wall. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with fear and excitement and something that might have been hope. She looked alive in a way she had not in years. She did not leave a note for her mother. There was nothing she could say that Margaret would understand or care about. Instead, she simply walked out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house that had been her prison for so long. Russell was waiting by his horse, and when he saw her, he smiled that devastating smile that made her knees weak. Ready? Ready, Josephine confirmed. He helped her mount behind him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid strength of him, the reality of what she was doing finally sinking in. They were going to get married. She was going to become Mrs. Russell Foster, wife to a cowboy she barely knew, leaving behind everything familiar for a future that was completely uncertain. The horse cantered toward town, and with every hoofbeat, Josephine felt lighter, as though years of burden were falling away behind her. She pressed her face against Russell's broad back and allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: happiness. The Reverend was surprised to see them, but not unkind. After Russell explained the situation in carefully edited terms, leaving out the worst of Margaret's treatment, but making it clear that Josephine needed to be removed from an unhappy home, the older man agreed to perform the ceremony. His wife served as one witness, and the church organist, who happened to be practicing, was pressed into service as the second. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, nothing like the elaborate weddings Josephine had sometimes imagined as a young girl. But as she stood beside Russell in the quiet church, speaking her vows in a voice that shook only slightly, she felt a sense of rightness that went deeper than any fancy trappings could have provided. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Russell turned to her with such tenderness in his eyes that Josephine felt tears spill down her cheeks. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Mrs. Foster, he murmured against her lips. My wife. My husband, Josephine replied, and the word felt like a miracle. They had just emerged from the church into the late afternoon sunlight when Margaret's voice cut through the air like a whip. Josephine Miller, what in God's name do you think you are doing? Josephine turned to see her mother stalking across the churchyard, her face mottled with rage. Behind her, a small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. It is Josephine Foster now, madam, Russell said calmly, positioning himself slightly in front of his new wife. We were just married. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed to furious slits. Married? You have no right. She is my daughter, and she will return home with me this instant. She is my wife, Russell said, his voice still calm, but with an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. And she will be coming home with me. You snake, Margaret hissed, addressing Russell. You came sniffing around my daughter like the opportunist you are, stealing her away. He did not steal me, Josephine said, finding her voice. She stepped out from behind Russell, standing straight despite the trembling in her limbs. I chose this, Mother. I chose him and a chance at a real life over staying with you and sleeping in the barn whenever it suited your purposes. The crowd murmured at this, and Margaret's face flushed even darker. How dare you air our private family matters in public? You ungrateful, selfish girl. After everything I sacrificed for you. You sacrificed nothing, Josephine said, years of suppressed pain and anger finally finding release. You used me as free labor and treated me like an inconvenience. But I am not your servant anymore, Mother. I am Russell's wife, and I am leaving with him. You will regret this, Margaret spat. When he shows his true colors, when you are living in squalor and breaking your back on some failing ranch, you will wish you had listened to me. But you will not be welcome back. If you walk away now, you are no daughter of mine. The words should have hurt, but instead Josephine felt only relief. Then I suppose I stopped being your daughter the first time you locked me out of my own home to sleep in the barn. Goodbye, Mother. She took Russell's offered hand, and together they walked away from Margaret's fury, from the gossiping crowd, from the life Josephine had endured for far too long. Russell's horse waited where they had left it, and he helped Josephine mount before swinging up behind her this time, wrapping one strong arm around her waist. Are you all right? He asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. I am better than I have been in 6 years, Josephine replied honestly. I am free. They rode west as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Fletcher Ranch, where Russell had been working, was a good operation, he explained, but he had already given his notice. He had saved nearly every penny of his wages for the past 3 years, and he had been looking into a piece of land about 20 miles north of Ellsworth, near the Smoky Hill River. It is not much yet, he said as they rode. Just a quarter section, 160 acres. But the land is good, there is water, and I can build us a proper house. It might be rough at first, but I promise you, Josephine, I will work every day to give you a home you deserve. As long as it has a real bed and I am not sent to sleep in the barn, it will be better than what I left behind, Josephine said, and felt him chuckle against her back. They spent that first night at a respectable boarding house in a small town called Wilson, 20 miles from Ellsworth. Russell paid for 2 rooms without being asked, a gesture that made Josephine realize how carefully he was trying to put her at ease. They had dinner in the boarding house's dining room, and Josephine could not remember the last time she had eaten a meal she had not prepared herself, had sat at a table and been served like a guest rather than serving others. Over plates of pot roast and potatoes, they talked like the newlyweds they were, learning about each other with an eagerness that made up for the unconventional nature of their union. Russell told her about growing up in eastern Texas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 16, about working his way north through various ranches, learning the cattle trade, and saving his money with single-minded determination. I always knew I wanted my own place, he said, his eyes distant with memory. Not to be rich, necessarily, but to have something that was mine, that I built with my own hands, and I knew that when I found it, I wanted to share it with someone special. I just did not expect to find her quite so soon. Josephine told him about her childhood, about the happy early years when her father was alive and their family had felt complete. She told him about the accident that killed him, a spooked horse and a terrible fall, and how her mother had changed afterward, becoming bitter and distant and increasingly focused on social climbing. I think she resented me, Josephine said quietly. I reminded her too much of him, perhaps. Or maybe she just saw me as a burden, another mouth to feed when she was trying to maintain a certain image. Whatever the reason, the love she once had for me curdled into something else. I stopped being her daughter and became her servant instead. Russell reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her skin. You will never be anyone's servant again. You are my wife, my partner, my equal. Whatever we will build together. That night, lying alone in her room, Josephine stared at the ceiling and marveled at the strangeness of her new reality. She was married, she had a husband. A man she barely knew had promised to build her a home and treat her as his equal, and she had bound her life to his on little more than faith and desperation, and a feeling she could not quite name, but that might have been the beginning of love. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, she dreamed of a house by a river, of warm amber eyes, and of never sleeping in a barn again. They spent the next several days traveling to Russell's land, stopping each night at boarding houses or respectable inns. Russell always careful of propriety, always gentle and patient as Josephine adjusted to her new circumstances. He seemed to understand without being told that she needed time, that the suddenness of their marriage and the trauma of her past made it difficult for her to fully trust, to fully open herself to the possibilities of their future together. The land, when they finally reached it, was more beautiful than Josephine had dared to hope. Rolling prairie stretched in every direction, grass rippling in the wind like waves on an ocean. The Smoky Hill River curved through the eastern edge of the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade from the relentless summer sun. In the distance, she could see the dark shapes of cattle grazing, part of a small herd Russell had managed to purchase. There, Russell said, pointing to a slight rise about 100 yards from the river. That is where I will build our house, high enough to avoid flooding, close enough to the water for convenience, with a view that will take your breath away every morning. Currently, there was only a rough dugout, a temporary shelter carved into the side of a hill and reinforced with timber. It was primitive, but surprisingly well made, and Russell had clearly worked to make it as comfortable as possible. There was a small stove for cooking, a table and 2 chairs he had built himself, and a bed frame with a real mattress stuffed with prairie grass. I know it is not much, Russell said, suddenly uncertain as Josephine looked around the small space, but it is only temporary. I will start on the house as soon as I can, and by winter we will have 4 walls and a real roof. Josephine turned and kissed him, cutting off his nervous explanation. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them, and she felt him freeze in surprise before his arms came around her, pulling her close. When she pulled back, she was smiling. It is perfect. Perfect? Russell looked skeptical. Josephine, it is a hole in the ground. It is a hole in the ground with a real bed that is mine to sleep in, Josephine said firmly. It is the first place I have ever lived where I am wanted and valued. That makes it perfect, Russell. Something in his expression shifted, softened. He touched her face with infinite gentleness, tracing the curve of her cheek with his thumb. You are wanted, he said quietly. You are so very wanted, Josephine. I hope someday I can make you understand just how much. The days that followed established a new rhythm to Josephine's life, so different from what she had known that it felt like living in a dream. She woke each morning to Russell's face on the pillow beside her, to his arm draped protectively across her waist, to the knowledge that she was safe and cherished. They had not yet consummated their marriage, and Russell had not pushed, seeming content to simply hold her through the night, to let her grow accustomed to his presence, to the intimacy of shared space and shared lives. During the day, they worked together to improve their homestead. Russell began the intensive labor of building their house, felling trees along the river for timber, digging out a proper foundation, laying stone for a chimney. Josephine helped where she could, holding boards steady while he sawed, fetching tools, mixing mortar. But she also established her own domain, planting a garden near the dugout, learning to cook on the small stove, exploring their land, and learning its contours and secrets. She had worked hard her entire life, but this was different. This work was for herself, for her own home, for a future she was building, rather than simply enduring. When her muscles ached at the end of the day, it felt earned rather than imposed. When she cooked dinner and served it to Russell, she did so gladly, and he thanked her with genuine appreciation, often insisting on doing the washing up himself to spare her hands. In the evenings, they sat outside the dugout and watched the sun set over the prairie, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. Russell told her about his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to build up his herd gradually to raise quality cattle rather than chasing quick profits. He spoke about possibly getting a few horses, about planting more trees to provide windbreaks, about all the improvements he envisioned over the years to come. Josephine found herself sharing dreams she had barely acknowledged to herself, small wishes that had seemed impossibly grand in her previous life. She wanted to learn to read better, to have books of her own. She wanted a real kitchen with a proper stove and a large table where they could entertain friends. She wanted children someday, a family they would raise with love and kindness, where no child would ever be made to feel unwanted or burdensome. We will have all of that, Russell promised, his hand warm in hers. Every bit of it, Josephine. I swear it. As the weeks passed and summer deepened into its full heat, something shifted between them. The initial strangeness of their situation began to fade, replaced by genuine affection, by a growing attachment that felt more real than anything Josephine had ever experienced. She found herself watching Russell as he worked, admiring the play of muscles beneath his sweat-dampened shirt, the careful precision of his movements, the complete focus he brought to every task. She noticed the way he looked at her, too, his eyes tracking her movements when he thought she was not paying attention, a hunger in his gaze that had nothing to do with food. The tension between them grew, not unpleasant but charged, like the air before a summer thunderstorm. It was Russell who finally addressed it, one evening as they prepared for bed. He caught her hand as she moved past him, gently pulling her to a stop. Josephine, I need to know something. Are you happy here? With me? She turned to face him fully, seeing the vulnerability in his expression, the genuine need to know that he had not made a terrible mistake in bringing her here. I am happier than I have ever been in my life. Truly? He searched her face as if looking for doubt. You do not regret marrying me? You do not wish you had stayed in town, found someone more established, someone who could have offered you better than a dugout and hard work? Josephine stepped closer, placing her hands flat against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palms. Russell Foster, you gave me something no one else ever could. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I was treated as worthless. You offered me freedom and a partnership and a chance to build something meaningful. I do not regret a single moment since I met you. His hands came up to cradle her face, his amber eyes intense. I am falling in love with you, Josephine. I think maybe I started falling the moment I pulled you away from that horse and looked into your eyes. Every day since has only made it stronger. Josephine's breath caught. I think I am falling in love with you too. I did not think it was possible to feel this way so quickly. But when I am with you, everything feels right in a way it never has before. Russell kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Josephine felt the last of her reservations dissolve. This was her husband, her partner, the man who had rescued her from a life of misery and offered her a future worth living. When he lifted her and carried her to their bed, she went willingly, eagerly, ready to truly become his wife in every sense of the word. Their lovemaking was tender and somewhat awkward, neither of them experienced, both learning together what brought pleasure and closeness. But it was also beautiful in its earnestness, in the care Russell took to be gentle, in the way they laughed together at their fumbling attempts, in the pure rightness of finally being fully joined, fully committed to each other in body as well as heart. Afterward, Josephine lay in Russell's arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to its normal rhythm. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her back, and she had never felt so content, so perfectly at peace. I am going to build you the finest house in this county, Russell murmured into her hair, a place worthy of you, with real glass windows and wooden floors and a big kitchen where you can make all those meals you talked about. And we will fill it with children and laughter and love. And you will never, ever have to sleep anywhere but in our bed, in our home, with me beside you. I will hold you to that promise, Josephine said, smiling against his skin. Good, Russell replied, because I mean every word. The summer wore on, hot and dry, and the house began to take shape on the rise Russell had chosen. The frame went up first, sturdy posts and beams that would support the roof. Then came the walls, constructed of sod bricks in the traditional prairie style, thick enough to keep out the cold in winter and the heat in summer. Russell worked from dawn until well past dusk, and Josephine worked alongside him whenever possible, learning to lay bricks, to mix mortar, to think about construction in ways she had never considered before. They made trips into the nearest town, a small settlement called Brookville, to purchase supplies: glass for windows, nails and hinges, boards for the floor, shingles for the roof. Each purchase represented a significant expense, carefully calculated from Russell's savings, and Josephine learned to appreciate the value of their resources, to think about their finances with the practical mindset of a true partner in their enterprise. It was on one such trip into Brookville that they encountered the first real test of their marriage. They had just loaded supplies into the wagon Russell had recently purchased, and Josephine was admiring a bolt of cloth in the dry goods store, thinking about making new curtains for their house when a woman's voice cut through the quiet afternoon. Well, if it is not the runaway bride, tell me, dear, are you enjoying your life of poverty with your cowboy? Josephine turned to find herself face to face with Mrs. Henderson, one of the women who had visited her mother in Ellsworth, forcing Josephine to sleep in the barn. The older woman's expression was smug, her eyes calculating as they took in Josephine's simple dress and work-worn hands. Mrs. Henderson, Josephine said evenly, refusing to be baited. What a surprise to see you so far from Ellsworth. My sister lives here in Brookville, Mrs. Henderson said. Your poor mother has told me all about your impulsive marriage, how you threw away your prospects for a penniless drifter. She is quite heartbroken, you know. My mother is not heartbroken, Josephine replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. She is disappointed that she lost her unpaid servant. There is a difference. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in mock shock. Such disrespect. Your mother raised you better than that, surely. My mother raised me to sleep in the barn when guests required a bed, Josephine said clearly, not caring who overheard. My husband raised our home with his own hands to ensure I would never be treated that way again. I know which I prefer. Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, Russell appeared at Josephine's side, his presence solid and reassuring. He nodded politely to the older woman, but addressed Josephine directly. Are you ready to go home, darling? I have everything loaded. Yes, Josephine said gratefully, taking his offered arm. I am quite ready. They left Mrs. Henderson sputtering behind them, and once they were safely in the wagon and heading out of town, Josephine felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. That woman used to visit my mother, she explained quietly. I slept in the barn 3 times when she stayed with us, because she required a comfortable bed, and I did not merit the same consideration. Russell's jaw tightened dangerously. If I had known the full extent of how you were treated, I would have gotten you out of that house far sooner. No one deserves to be treated the way your mother treated you, Josephine. No one. It does not matter now, Josephine said, meaning it. That life is behind me. I have a new life now, a better one, with you. Russell pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to her, his expression fierce. Listen to me. You are worth more than all the Mrs. Hendersons and society ladies in Kansas put together. You work harder, you are kinder, you have more genuine character in your smallest finger than they have in their entire bodies. And I am so damn proud to call you my wife that I could burst with it. Do you understand? Tears pricked Josephine's eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. I understand, and I am proud to be your wife, Russell. So very proud. He kissed her there in the middle of the dusty road, thorough and possessive, and Josephine kissed him back with equal fervor, grateful beyond words for this man who saw her value when so many others had not. By the time autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods gold and bringing blessed relief from the summer heat, the house was nearly complete. It was not a grand structure, but it was solid and well built, with real glass windows and a proper stone fireplace and a kitchen that made Josephine's heart sing with joy. There were two bedrooms, one for them and one for future children, and a main room that served as both parlor and dining area. The day they moved their few possessions from the dugout to the house, Josephine stood in the middle of the main room and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Rough wooden floors that Russell had sanded smooth with his own hands. Walls made of sod, but covered inside with whitewash that made everything bright and clean. Windows that let in light and air and provided views of the prairie and the river. A ceiling high enough that Russell could stand upright without ducking. "It is perfect," she whispered. Russell came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "It is ours," he said simply. "Every inch of it, built with our own hands and our own labor. No one can ever take it from us or tell you that you do not belong here. This is your home, Josephine. Always and forever." That night, they christened their new bedroom properly, making love in their own house for the first time. The bed frame Russell had built holding the mattress they had shared since their wedding night. Afterward, Josephine lay awake for a long time, listening to Russell breathe beside her, staring at the ceiling of her own home and feeling a contentment so profound it was almost painful. She had a husband who loved her. She had a home that was truly hers. She had work that mattered and a future that looked bright. After so many years of darkness and despair, she had found her way to the light, and it was more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. Winter came to the Kansas prairie with bitter cold and howling winds, but the house Russell had built kept them warm and safe. They spent long evenings by the fireplace, Russell working on various small projects, mending tack or carving wooden spoons, while Josephine sewed or mended clothes or worked on her reading using a primer Russell had purchased for her in town. He was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging her progress. Under his gentle tutelage, Josephine's reading improved significantly, and soon she was able to work her way through the few books they owned, hungry for the stories and information they contained. The cattle required constant attention even in winter, and there were days when Russell had to be out in the bitter cold for hours, checking on the animals, breaking ice on the river so they could drink, hauling hay from the small barn he had built to store feed. Josephine worried about him constantly on those days, watching anxiously from the window until she saw his tall figure trudging back through the snow toward home. She would have hot coffee ready when he came in, and stew or soup simmering on the stove, and she would help him out of his frozen outer layers and rub warmth back into his reddened hands. Those quiet acts of care and service felt nothing like the endless drudgery of her life with her mother. This was love expressed through action, through choosing to ease her husband's burdens because his well-being mattered to her more than her own comfort. Christmas that year was simple but joyful. They had little money for gifts, but Russell surprised Josephine with a beautiful shawl he had purchased during a supply run, soft wool in a deep blue that matched her eyes. Josephine gave him a shirt she had sewn in secret, the stitches careful and even, fitted to his exact measurements. They attended Christmas service at a small church in Brookville, and Josephine felt a fierce pride walking in beside Russell, his hand warm around hers, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. She saw Mrs. Henderson in the congregation, but ignored her pointedly, refusing to let the older woman's judgment poison her happiness. After the service, they were approached by several other couples, ranch families from the surrounding area, who introduced themselves with friendly warmth. Invitations were extended to future gatherings, to barn dances and quilting bees and community suppers. Josephine accepted them all, grateful for the prospect of friendship, of building connections beyond just her and Russell. On the ride home, with snow falling gently around them and the wagon rocking steadily beneath them, Josephine leaned against Russell's shoulder and felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. She had learned not to trust happiness, to always expect it to be snatched away. But this felt different, solid, and real, and earned through hard work and genuine affection. "What are you thinking about?" Russell asked, his arm tightening around her. "How happy I am," Josephine said honestly. "And how strange it feels to say that and mean it." "Get used to it," Russell said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." Spring arrived in a rush of green and growing things, the prairie transforming from brown dormancy to vibrant life seemingly overnight. Josephine's garden flourished, providing vegetables that supplemented their diet and would eventually fill the root cellar Russell was digging behind the house. The cattle, which had survived the winter in good condition thanks to Russell's careful management, began to produce calves, expanding their herd. It was during that spring that Josephine began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses, usually reliable, did not come. Her breasts felt tender, and she found herself exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might prove false, but after 2 months of missed cycles and increasingly undeniable symptoms, she knew it was time to tell Russell. She chose a mild evening in late April after they had finished dinner and were sitting on the porch Russell had built across the front of the house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Russell," she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, his expression immediately concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Josephine assured him quickly. "Better than fine, actually. I am, Russell, I think I am with child." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a grin spread across his face, so wide and genuine that it transformed his entire countenance. "Truly? A baby? We are going to have a baby?" "I believe so," Josephine said, her own smile matching his. "I have missed 2 monthly courses, and I have all the other signs. I cannot be certain without a doctor's confirmation, but I am fairly sure." Russell let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to Brookville, then swept Josephine into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. When he finally set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "A baby," he repeated as if testing the word. "Our baby. Josephine, you have made me the happiest man in Kansas, in the whole United States, in the entire world." "I am glad," Josephine said, touching his face gently. "I want this child so much, Russell. I want to give them everything I never had, all the love and security and acceptance. I want to be a good mother." "You will be an extraordinary mother," Russell said fiercely. "Our children will be the luckiest kids alive, having you to raise them." They made plans that evening, sitting close together on the porch as the stars emerged overhead. They would need to expand the house eventually, add more bedrooms as their family grew. They would need baby clothes and blankets and a cradle, which Russell vowed to build himself. They would need to be more careful about money, saving for the doctor's fees and the additional expenses a child would bring. But none of those practical concerns could dampen their joy. They were going to be parents, going to create a family together, going to fill their home with the laughter and love they had both longed for. It felt like the culmination of everything they had been working toward, the final piece that would make their lives complete. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Josephine felt remarkably well, with only mild nausea in the early months that soon passed. Her body changed gradually, her waist thickening, and then her belly beginning to swell with unmistakable evidence of the life growing within her. Russell became almost comically protective, insisting that she rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, constantly fretting about whether she was eating enough or sleeping enough or working too hard. Josephine found his concern endearing rather than stifling, a stark contrast to her mother's complete indifference to her well-being. They made several trips into Brookville to consult with the doctor there, a competent man named Dr. Harris, who examined Josephine thoroughly and pronounced both her and the baby healthy. He estimated the birth would occur sometime in late December or early January, making their child a winter baby. As summer deepened and Josephine's belly grew round and prominent, they received their first visitors at the ranch. Two couples from the surrounding area, the Johnsons and the Martins, rode over one Sunday afternoon with food and gifts for the coming baby. Josephine was touched by their generosity, by the easy friendship they offered, by the way they welcomed her and Russell into the community without judgment or reservation. The women, Sarah Johnson and Emma Martin, were full of advice about pregnancy and childbirth, sharing their own experiences with a frankness that Josephine found both reassuring and slightly alarming. They promised to be there when her time came, to help with the delivery and the first difficult weeks of new motherhood. The men talked cattle and crops with Russell, swapping information about water rights and grazing land and the best places to purchase supplies. By the time the visitors left, with promises to return soon and invitations to visit their own ranches, Josephine felt as though she had finally found what had been missing from her life for so long: community, connection, the sense of belonging somewhere and being valued for who she was. That night, lying in bed with Russell's hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling their child move beneath his palm, Josephine reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in barely more than a year. She had gone from sleeping in a barn, unloved and unwanted, to sleeping in her own bed in her own home, cherished by a husband who adored her and eagerly awaiting the arrival of their first child. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly into the darkness. "Marrying me so quickly, taking on the responsibility of a wife when you had barely started your ranch?" "Never," Russell said immediately. "Not for a single moment, Josephine. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You make every hard day worth it, every challenge manageable. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "I feel the same," Josephine whispered. "You saved me, Russell. Not just from that horse in the street, but from a life that was slowly crushing me. You gave me a future worth living." "We saved each other," Russell corrected gently. "I was just going through the motions before I met you, building a ranch but not really knowing why, not having anyone to share it with or work toward something bigger than just surviving. You gave me purpose, Josephine. You gave me a reason to build something that would last." As autumn arrived and the prairie grasses turned golden, Russell worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming winter and the new baby. He laid in extra supplies, cut more firewood than they could possibly need, made sure the house was sealed tight against the cold. He built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge that could harm delicate baby skin, and Josephine sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her hands moving with loving care over each stitch. Her body grew heavy and ungainly as the baby grew larger, and there were days when she felt like a lumbering cow rather than a graceful human. But Russell never treated her as anything less than beautiful, constantly touching her belly to feel the baby move, kissing her with undiminished passion, telling her she was radiant with the glow of impending motherhood. In November, they received an unexpected visitor. Josephine was in the kitchen, working on bread dough, when she heard a horse approach. Russell was out checking on the cattle, so she wiped her hands and went to the door, curious about who might be calling. Her breath caught when she recognized the woman dismounting in the yard. It was her mother. Margaret Miller looked older than Josephine remembered, her face more lined, her expression uncertain in a way that was completely foreign to the domineering woman Josephine had known. She tied her horse to the rail and approached the house slowly, her eyes taking in the solid structure, the well-maintained yard, the clear signs of prosperity and care. "Josephine," Margaret said as her daughter appeared in the doorway, "may I come in?" For a moment, Josephine considered refusing, considered turning her back on the woman who had made her childhood and adolescence a misery. But curiosity won out over anger, and she stepped aside, allowing Margaret to enter. Her mother's eyes widened as she took in the interior of the house, the clean, whitewashed walls, the comfortable furniture, the curtains Josephine had sewn, the clear evidence of a happy home. Her gaze lingered on Josephine's swollen belly, and something flickered across her face that might have been regret. "You are expecting," Margaret said unnecessarily. "Yes," Josephine replied, one hand moving protectively to her stomach. "In about 2 months, the doctor says." Margaret was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "The house is beautiful. Your husband built it?" "We built it," Josephine corrected. "Together. Russell did most of the heavy work, but I helped. This is our home, Mother. Ours." Margaret sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table without being invited, suddenly looking very tired. "I came to apologize," she said, the words clearly difficult for her, "and to see if perhaps we might reconcile." Josephine felt a storm of emotions rise up in her chest, anger and hurt and a small, stubborn part of her that still wanted her mother's approval despite everything. "Why now? After more than a year of silence, why come now?" "Because I have had time to think," Margaret said. "And to hear the gossip. Everyone in Ellsworth talks about how you are thriving out here, how your husband is building a successful ranch, how happy you are. Mrs. Henderson came back from Brookville full of stories about seeing you at church, looking prosperous and content." She paused, then added more quietly, "And I have been alone in that house with nothing but my thoughts and my regrets for company." "You told me I would regret marrying Russell," Josephine said, her voice harder than she intended. "You said I would be living in squalor, that he would show his true colors. Were you disappointed to be wrong?" "I was angry," Margaret admitted, "and frightened. You were all I had left of your father, and I drove you away with my bitterness and my ambition and my complete failure to see what I was doing to you." She looked up, meeting Josephine's eyes directly for the first time. "I treated you abominably. I made you sleep in the barn like an animal while I entertained people who did not matter. I worked you like a servant and gave you none of the love and care you deserved. I was a terrible mother, Josephine, and I am sorry." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. She had never heard her mother apologize for anything, had never seen this vulnerability, this raw honesty. It did not erase the years of pain, but it was something. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you treat me that way? I was your daughter. I loved you. I would have done anything to make you proud of me." "I know," Margaret whispered. "And that makes it worse, does it not? You looked so much like your father, Josephine. Every time I saw you, I was reminded of what I had lost, of how my life had not turned out the way I had hoped. Instead of cherishing you as his legacy, I resented you for being a living reminder of my pain. It was wrong and cruel, and I have no excuse except that grief made me into someone I do not recognize when I look back." The sound of a horse approaching made both women look up. Russell appeared in the doorway a moment later, and his expression hardened when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Miller," he said coolly, "I did not expect to see you here." "I came to apologize to my daughter," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "And to you as well, Mr. Foster. I judged you harshly and unfairly when we first met, and I was wrong to do so. You have given Josephine a life I never could have provided, and you clearly love her very much." Russell moved to stand beside Josephine, his arms sliding protectively around her shoulders. "I do love her, more than anything in this world." "I can see that," Margaret said. She turned back to Josephine. "I do not expect you to forgive me immediately, or perhaps ever, but I hope that someday, maybe, we might have some kind of relationship. I would very much like to know my grandchild when he or she arrives." Josephine leaned into Russell's strength, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I need time to think about it, Mother. You hurt me very deeply, and trust is not something that can be rebuilt overnight." I understand, Margaret said. I will leave you in peace. But if you ever decide you want to see me, you know where I am. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. For what it is worth, you have built a beautiful life here, Josephine. Your father would have been very proud of you. After Margaret left, Josephine stood in Russell's embrace for a long time, processing the unexpected visit and the emotions it had stirred up. I do not know what to think, she finally said. Part of me wants to send her away and never see her again. But another part of me wonders if people can really change, if maybe she genuinely regrets what she did. Whatever you decide, I will support you, Russell said firmly. If you want to try to rebuild a relationship with her, we will do that. If you want to keep her at a distance, that is fine too. This is your choice, Josephine. No one else gets to decide this for you. I think, Josephine said slowly, that I am not ready to forgive her yet. Maybe someday, but not now. The wounds are still too fresh, and I have my own family to focus on. She placed her hand over Russell's where it rested on her belly. Our family. That is what matters most to me. Our family, Russell agreed, kissing her temple. Now and always. Winter settled over the prairie, and as December turned toward January, Josephine's time drew near. The baby had dropped lower, and she felt the constant pressure, the occasional tightening that Dr. Harris had told her would increase as labor approached. Sarah Johnson and Emma Martin had both promised to come when her time arrived, and Russell had worked out a system with their neighbors where he could ride over and alert them when Josephine went into labor. It was a cold January night, the wind howling outside and snow falling thick and fast, when Josephine woke to a sensation she had never felt before, a tightening across her belly that grew and grew until it was almost painful, then slowly released. She lay still for a moment, timing the contractions as Dr. Harris had instructed, and realized they were coming regularly, about 20 minutes apart. Russell, she said softly, touching his shoulder. Russell, wake up. I think it is time. He was awake instantly, his eyes wide in the darkness. The baby? Now? But the snow. The baby does not care about the snow, Josephine said, managing a smile despite the anxiety curling in her stomach. You need to go get Sarah and Emma. And you should probably fetch Dr. Harris too, if you can reach Brookville safely. Russell was already pulling on his clothes, moving with swift efficiency despite the fear she could see in his eyes. I will be as quick as I can. Will you be all right alone? I will be fine, Josephine assured him, though she was not entirely certain of that. This is going to take hours yet. First babies always do, Sarah said. He kissed her fiercely before leaving, bundling into his heavy coat and heading out into the storm. Josephine heard him saddle his horse and ride out, and then she was alone with the wind and the snow and the growing intensity of the contractions. She got up and moved around the house, trying to stay calm, trying to remember everything the other women had told her about labor and birth. She built up the fire until the main room was warm, gathered clean linens and blankets, filled the kettle with water, and set it to boil. Between contractions, she was fine, almost calm. During them, she had to stop and breathe through the tightening, through the increasing pressure and discomfort. Russell returned about 2 hours later with Sarah, Emma, and miraculously Dr. Harris, who had been staying with the Johnsons due to the storm and had been available when Russell came riding up in a panic. The women swept in with calm efficiency, taking over the preparations, helping Josephine out of her nightgown and into a clean shift, checking her progress with gentle, experienced hands. You are doing well, Doctor, Harris said after examining her. It will be a while yet, but everything is progressing normally. Try to rest between contractions and save your strength for when you really need it. The labor continued through the rest of the night and into the next day, long and exhausting but manageable. Russell stayed by her side, except when the women shooed him out during examinations, holding her hand through contractions, wiping sweat from her forehead, whispering encouragement and love and promises that she was doing wonderfully, that it would be over soon, that he was so proud of her. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already beginning to set, when the pushing stage finally began. Josephine was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, her body wrung out and aching, but she gathered her remaining strength and bore down when Dr. Harris instructed, determined to bring her baby into the world. "That is it," the doctor encouraged. "I can see the head. One more good push, Mrs. Foster. You can do this." Josephine gripped Russell's hand so hard she thought she might break his fingers and pushed with everything she had. She felt an enormous pressure, then a sudden release, and then the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, her baby's first cry, loud and indignant and perfect. "A boy," Dr. Harris announced, holding up a tiny, squirming infant. "You have a son, Mr. and Mrs. Foster. A big, healthy boy." Josephine fell back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Sarah cleaned and wrapped the baby, then placed him in her arms. He was red and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. His eyes squinted open, unfocused, but trying to see this new world he had entered. "Our son," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. He touched the baby's tiny hand, and the infant's fingers immediately curled around his father's finger, gripping tight. "Oh God, Josephine, look at him. He is perfect." "He is," Josephine agreed, unable to look away from the small face. "He really is. What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had not settled on anything definite. Russell looked at his son for a long moment, then said, "What about Daniel? After the prophet who survived the lion's den. It seems fitting, given the storm he was born into." "Daniel Foster," Josephine said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world, little one. Welcome home." The weeks after Daniel's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning to care for this tiny new person who depended on them for everything. Josephine was exhausted but happier than she had ever been, and Russell proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Daniel when he was fussy, changing nappies without complaint, staring at his son with an expression of such pure love that it made Josephine's heart ache. As winter gradually gave way to spring, their little family settled into a new rhythm. Daniel grew rapidly, becoming more alert and responsive, his dark eyes tracking movement and his mouth curving into what might have been smiles when Russell made funny faces at him. Josephine marveled at every milestone, every tiny change, unable to believe that she and Russell had created this perfect small human. In March, about 2 months after Daniel's birth, they received a letter from Margaret. It was brief and formal, congratulating them on the birth of their son and including a small blanket she had knitted herself. Josephine stared at the blanket for a long time, at the careful, even stitches that spoke of hours of work, of genuine effort to create something meaningful. "What do you want to do?" Russell asked, watching her face. "I think," Josephine said slowly, "that I might be ready to let her visit, not to reconcile completely, not yet, but to meet her grandson. Every child deserves to know their family, and maybe everyone deserves a second chance." So Margaret came, arriving on a mild April day when the prairie was bursting into bloom. She was tentative and careful, asking permission before entering, before holding the baby, treating Josephine and Russell with a respect that seemed genuine. When Josephine placed Daniel in her arms, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He looks like your father," she whispered, around the eyes and the shape of his face. "Oh, Josephine, he is beautiful." It was not a complete healing, not an instant return to a mother-daughter relationship, but it was a beginning, a first step towards something that might eventually become forgiveness. Margaret visited occasionally after that, always respectful of their boundaries, always careful not to overstep. And slowly, very slowly, some of the old wounds began to close. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and steady progress and deepening love. The ranch prospered, under Russell's careful management, the herd growing larger and healthier with each passing season. They added onto the house as their family expanded, welcoming a daughter named Sarah 2 years after Daniel, and then another son, Thomas, 2 years after that. Josephine learned to be the mother she had always wanted to have, loving her children fiercely, never making them feel unwanted or burdensome. She taught them to read and write, to work hard, but also to play, to treat others with kindness, and to stand up for themselves when necessary. Russell was an equally devoted father, patient and loving, teaching his sons to ride and work cattle and treat women with respect, teaching his daughter that she could do anything her brothers could do if she put her mind to it. They became pillars of their community, hosting gatherings at their ranch, helping neighbors in times of trouble, contributing to the building of a school in Brookville where their children could receive a proper education. The house that had started as a simple structure grew and evolved with their family, Russell constantly making improvements, adding rooms, building a large covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch their children play in the yard. Margaret remained a part of their lives, though always at a respectful distance. She never fully regained Josephine's complete trust, but she became a doting grandmother, bringing gifts for the children, telling them stories about their grandfather, helping with babysitting when needed. It was not the relationship they might have had if Margaret had been a better mother from the start, but it was better than Josephine had ever thought possible during those dark days of sleeping in the barn. On a warm evening in the summer of 1886, 10 years after that fateful day when Russell had pulled Josephine from the path of a runaway horse, they sat together on their porch watching the sun set over the prairie. Their children played nearby, Daniel now a sturdy boy of 9, Sarah a spirited 7-year-old, and Thomas an energetic 5-year-old who kept his siblings constantly entertained. "Do you ever think about that day?" Russell asked, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "The day we met?" "All the time," Josephine admitted. "I think about how close I came to being trampled by that horse, how different my life would be if you had not been there to pull me out of the way." "I think about how close I came to not being there," Russell said. "I almost stayed at the ranch that day, but something made me ride into town, some instinct that I needed to be there. I have never believed much in fate, but I think maybe we were meant to find each other, Josephine. I think maybe all of it, the good and the bad, led us exactly where we needed to be." Josephine leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play, thinking about the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love and a shared conviction that they both deserved better than what they had been given. "I used to sleep in a barn," she said softly. "My own mother made me sleep in a barn because I was less important than guests, less worthy of comfort and care. And now I sleep every night in a real bed, in a real house that we built with our own hands, beside a man who loves me more than I ever dreamed possible. Sometimes I still cannot quite believe it is real." "It is real," Russell assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And it is forever, Josephine. You will never sleep anywhere but beside me, in our home, surrounded by our family. That is a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life." "I know," Josephine said, her heart full to bursting. "And that is the greatest gift you could ever give me. Not the house or the ranch or anything material, but the simple promise that I belong somewhere, that I am wanted and valued and loved, that I will never be cast out or pushed aside or made to feel less than I am." They sat together as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their children's laughter echoing across the prairie they called home. It was a simple life in many ways, full of hard work and constant challenges, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection and a commitment to being better than what they had come from. Daniel came running up to the porch, his face flushed with exertion and happiness. "Papa, Mama, come see the fireflies. They are lighting up the whole field." Russell and Josephine exchanged a smile and rose together, following their son out into the gathering darkness, where thousands of fireflies danced through the air like fallen stars. Sarah and Thomas joined them, all three children darting about trying to catch the elusive insects, their shrieks of delight piercing the quiet evening. Josephine stood with Russell's arm around her waist, watching their children play, and felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had dreamed of during all those nights in the barn. This simple happiness, this sense of family and belonging and unconditional love. And somehow, against all odds, she had found it, had built it with her own hands, and a cowboy with amber eyes who had seen her worth when no one else had. Happy? Russell murmured in her ear. Happier than I have words to express, Josephine replied honestly. Thank you, Russell, for everything, for seeing me, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life. Thank you for saying yes, Russell replied, for taking a chance on a cowboy you barely knew, for building this life with me, for being the most extraordinary wife and mother and partner I could have ever hoped for. You made all my dreams come true, Josephine. They stood together in the firefly-lit darkness, their children playing around them, their home solid and welcoming behind them, and their future stretching out bright and full of promise before them. The girl who had slept in barns was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who had a partner who cherished her, who had built a legacy of love that would endure for generations. And every night for the rest of her long and happy life, Josephine Foster slept safe and warm in her own bed, in her own home, beside the man who had made sure she would never be cast out or forgotten again. The cowboy who had promised she would sleep inside forever had kept his word, and in doing so had given her not just shelter, but a life worth living, a love worth cherishing, and a happiness that transformed everything that had come before, from tragedy into the necessary path that had led her home. Their ranch continued to prosper over the decades, becoming one of the most respected operations in the region. Daniel grew up to be a fine cattleman like his father, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch. Sarah married a local schoolteacher and stayed nearby, giving Josephine and Russell the joy of watching their grandchildren grow. Thomas, always the adventurous one, tried his hand at various pursuits before eventually returning to the ranch and settling down with a girl from Brookville. As Russell and Josephine grew older, their love only deepened, tempered by years of shared work and shared joy and shared challenges overcome together. They became the couple other families looked to as an example, their devotion to each other obvious in every glance, every touch, every quiet conversation on their porch as the sun set over the prairie they had tamed together. Margaret lived to see her great-grandchildren, her relationship with Josephine never fully restored to what it might have been, but civil and occasionally even warm. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, and Josephine wept at her funeral, mourning not the mother Margaret had been, but the mother she might have become if she had chosen differently all those years ago. But those were minor shadows in an otherwise bright life. Josephine and Russell celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th, then their 35th, each year bringing new reasons to be grateful, new moments of joy, new reminders that they had chosen well all those years ago when a young woman had said yes to a cowboy's impulsive proposal. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration, filling the house that had started so small with noise and laughter and love. There were nearly 30 people present now, 3 generations of Fosters, all descended from a desperate girl who had slept in barns and a determined cowboy who had promised her something better. That night, after everyone had finally gone to bed or headed home, Russell and Josephine sat alone on their porch one more time, the same stars shining overhead that had witnessed the beginning of their story 4 decades earlier. 40 years, Josephine said wonderingly. Can you believe it has been 40 years since you pulled me out of that horse's path? Best decision I ever made, Russell said, his voice rougher now with age but still full of warmth. Stopping to help a beautiful girl who looked like she needed saving. Little did I know she would save me right back. We saved each other, Josephine corrected gently, the same words he had spoken to her all those years ago on their wedding night. We built this life together, Russell. Every bit of it, from nothing but hope and love and determination. And we built it well, Russell said, gesturing to the house behind them, to the land stretching out in all directions, to the legacy of family they had created. Look at what we made, Josephine. Look at what came from one moment of courage, one leap of faith. Josephine looked at her husband, seeing past the gray in his hair and the lines on his face to the young cowboy with amber eyes who had offered her a future when she had none. I would do it all again, she said softly. Every moment, every challenge, every hard day, because they all led to this, to a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was sleeping in that barn. You will never sleep in a barn again, Russell said, repeating the promise he had made so many times over the years. You will always sleep beside me in our home where you belong. I know, Josephine said, taking his hand in hers, their fingers interlacing with the ease of 4 decades of practice. And that promise, more than anything else, made me feel truly safe, truly loved, truly home. They sat together as they had so many nights before, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the sounds of the prairie, feeling the solid foundation of everything they had built together beneath them. And when they finally rose and went inside to their bedroom, to the bed Russell had built with his own hands all those years ago, they lay down together with the deep contentment of 2 people who had found exactly what they were meant to find in each other. Josephine Foster, who had once been Josephine Miller, who had once been nothing more than an unwanted daughter sleeping in barns, closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, wrapped in her husband's arms, in her own home, with her family safe around her. And she smiled, because she knew that when she woke, she would still be here, still be cherished, still be exactly where she belonged. The cowboy had promised she would sleep inside forever, and he had spent 40 years proving that his word was as solid as the house he had built, as enduring as the love they shared, as permanent as the life they had created together from nothing but courage and hope and a willingness to believe that sometimes the most impulsive decisions turn out to be the rightest ones of all.